I'm feeling mighty lonesome, haven't slept a wink. I walk the floor and watch the door, and in between I drink black coffee.
This is supposed to be in English, so even a few introductory works about the publishing house, or specifically the book series that this book has been published in, I think are in order in English, because who knows where this video, maybe it will find its way to England, and people will be interested in what we are publishing here, the translations. So my name is Tomáš Hříbek, and I'm based in the Institute of Philosophy here in Prague, and we have our own publishing house, Philosophia, and part of it is this book series whose name translates as Contemporary World or Today's World. And we started this project, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, with the intention of publishing books that are not necessarily committed to any particular tradition in philosophy, but the books that are made available through that book series. I mean, the only condition is clarity and accessibility to readership that we are imagining should not consist exclusively from philosophers, people educated in philosophy, educated people who don't necessarily have background in philosophy and are interested in various topics of public concern. So so far we've published books on immigration and refugees, the import of humanistic education, climate crisis, climate change, and others. And I guess with this book we are making kind of a breakthrough, because Dr. Tony Milligan of King's College, the University of London, agreed to write a book, obviously in English, but he agreed to have this book translated into the Czech language and have the Czech version published ahead of the English version, which I don't know if you have already a contract for the English book.
I'm contractually obliged to bring out one other book, without which
this might be it.
Before I'm allowed to bring that one.
Oh,
out.
all right, okay, all right,
yes.
Cool. But apparently we are so cutting edge that that you know, may this be a trend that continues in the future, right? That we are ahead of the English language publishing houses. So this is obviously great responsibility and honor. And we are hoping that this book will spark some interest locally, because it's on this topical issue of populism. It's called Truth at a Time of Populism. I should perhaps introduce Tony Milligan more. He's a Scottish philosopher, currently based at the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at King's College at the University of London. But very soon he's going to transition to a very intricate project involving space ethics. Can you explain it yourself? Because you...
Yes, there's the big project called Cosmological Visionaries, which is carrying out research in China and in Russia, and looking at the ways in which you can build dialogue between indigenous people and local scientists to try and track the processes of climate change on the ground. So it is, yes, it is, there are many different pieces to this jigsaw, and it will be very interesting.
said that it's going to involve a lot of traveling.
Yes.
So you will. The project is based in Britain, but you will do a lot of traveling to Russia and China.
Yes.
Constantly back and forth.
Yunnan and Siberia, which will be interesting because I'm not, although from Scotland, I am not necessarily a cold weather creature, and I'm thinking that perhaps I will need at least a new coat and an appreciation of the aesthetic of the snow and the ice. I think this will help.
Hopefully. Perhaps I should also mention that it's not exactly a coincidence that Tony agreed to have this book published with Philosophia in this book series, because he was for several years a collaborator of this ethics research project based at the philosophy department at the University of Pardubice, and as far as I know, you were also instrumental in editing an anthology on philosophy of love that includes works by some philosophers associated with philosophy department in Pardubice.
Yes, Camilla Pizzowska and
yeah.
some other colleagues. Yes.
And you still, I guess, continue kind of working relations with them.
Yes, there's an ongoing, I have an ongoing collaboration with several colleagues from the Czech Republic, including a colleague here tonight who's editing a volume related to space. I will be doing a chapter for that. Yes.
Decolonization.
Yes.
Wow. All right, so perhaps you would like to introduce your book briefly.
Yes.
Use as much time as you need, as much or as little as you like, to briefly to give us the, I guess, the essence of the book.
Okay. I think I should stand. I think that
if you like, but
this is me standing.
Even without microphone, does anybody have a problem hearing, even in the back? No? So we don't really need a microphone.
No. Okay, if I am not loud enough, then raise a hand. I realise also that I have, or you may have detected, the faintest hint, a very small amount of a Scottish accent. It's very subtle, but it is there. So if it is too Scottish, then raise a hand. But if it is not Scottish enough, 2 hands, because that can be done as well.
It's lovely.
Yes. So the book has 2 interlocking themes that are difficult to join together in a plausible way. I want to say something about truth as a general concept, as something that fits into our everyday ethical practice, as something that philosophers have spoken of and developed theories about. So there's the truth component. Because I happen to think that truth is important. Truth matters. And I also want to say something about politics and the particular political juncture, the point in time that we find ourselves at. When there seems to be a great deal of lying in public life. I don't want to shock you, but some politicians are not entirely honest. That is the biggest revelation of today. But on the other hand, when have politicians ever been entirely honest? So I do not want to be overly impressed by the idea that there is a sudden radical change in the relationship between political figures, and I will name a particular figure, President Trump, Donald Trump. He's not alone. There are others who may not be entirely honest. But I do not want to say that the most interesting way to join together the theme of truth and the theme of politics is the rather simple one of saying, we have entered a new era. This is an era of post-truth. The fundamental relationship of politicians to truth has changed. I do not want to say that for two reasons. One is that it does not strike me as correct. It strikes me that there has always been a problem there. That political life introduces pressures upon you which make it exceptionally difficult to be comprehensively truthful. And the second consideration is that although these ideas of post-truth and a new era of moving beyond truth are new to us, they are in fact very old ideas. Practically every generation has said much the same thing. If you look at the writings of Alexander Koyré in the 1940s, better known for his Galilean studies, he has a wonderful little pamphlet about what's happening in political life, what's happening with truth. And Koyré introduces this idea. He's writing around about 1942, 43. I think it comes out about 45, 46. He says, in times of war, truth is a casualty. It is sacrificed. But what happens when you have political regimes which try to convince you that you're permanently in a state of war, that you're permanently engaging in a struggle against the other power bloc, a war on crime, a war against drugs, or anything of that sort? It seems that the wartime exception, whereby political leaders are allowed to be deceptive, suddenly becomes the norm. There is a permanent and ongoing justification for failures to tell the truth. And this is Koyré writing in the 1940s. And you get very much the same idea in George Orwell in 1984, writing several years after Koyré. I don't know if Orwell actually read Koyré. Then you get Hannah Arendt in the 1950s and especially in the later 1960s, saying that there is a crisis of deception in politics. There's a crisis in the Republic. A failure of truthfulness is undermining the very basis of liberal democracy. And she has a point. I mean, we might think of the small lies that politicians tell today, but when Hannah Arendt was writing in the late 1960s, you had an American government at war in Vietnam, claiming that they were not at war, that there was no war in Vietnam. There was merely a police action. Then we have people in the 1980s, Jacques Derrida, with a very excellent piece on the history of the lie, which is interesting. Derrida and Arendt understand that lying is something complex, lying is something interesting. We speak a lot about truth, we don't say enough about lying. And Derrida is promoting this idea that there is something new about lying in public life, something radically different, something that has changed. And then we have all of the discourses that emerge about the idea of post-truth. So this is quite an old idea, convincing ourselves that something dramatic has changed in the relationship to truth. I don't think it's right. First of all, I don't think that we can move beyond truth. There is always a reliance upon truth-telling. Lies depend upon a background of truth-telling. If I lie to you, my ability to succeed in the lie depends upon an expectation of truth. The expectation of truth in our communication is the backdrop against which the lie occurs. Our ability simply to understand one another, to make sense of each other's utterances, of our uses of language, depends upon our appreciation of what? Well, many things, but one of them is an appreciation of the truth conditions of what I say, the conditions under which my utterances would be true. To go beyond truth and a recognition of the importance of truth would be to go beyond language itself. But, I don't want to say nothing has changed. What has changed in political life is not our fundamental relationship to truth, but there are a series of developments. There is the rise of populism. There are these contradictory, shape-shifting moves in one direction and another towards political centralisation, towards the pushing down of power to lower levels, and then reactions back to centralisation again. All of these things are occurring. And I want to provide some kind of understanding of the nature of these political changes that make it so easy to lie, that make that side of politics, which has always been there, so prominent. And I will not give you a long justification for what I'm going to say, partly because I can speak for as long as I like, but I have to be brief as well. And this is this is Tomáš's wisdom showing through. Brevity is a good idea. So what do I think is going on? Essentially, we're not entering into a new relationship between truth and politics, but we are going through a period of political transition. If you think about, particularly within democracies, if you think about the classic model of democracy which emerges out of the 19th century, it is fundamentally a model which is based upon representation. You vote, or someone else votes, or a section of the population votes, and then the decision makers do all of the rest. We are no longer happy with that. There are all sorts of factors such as a greater level of education among the public at large, the wonderful world of the internet, in which we freely, perhaps a little too freely at times, give our views on a wide range of subjects and expect our voices to be heard. So political changes, which have in fact been going on for more than a century, and one can see them particularly in the United States, have been given a new impetus. But an impetus towards what? And my thought here is not a new one, but comes out of the work of certain political theorists and legal scholars in the United States. The thought is that we're moving towards an increasingly hybrid form of democracy. One in which there are components of the dominant system of representative democracy, But increasingly, you have components of direct democracy as well. Systems of referenda, voter initiatives, even representative recall. And there are countries, places like the United Kingdom, which is undergoing a little bit of turmoil at the moment. You may have noticed that as well. One of the reasons why I insist upon being introduced as a Scottish philosopher. Where they want to, where they're finding it especially difficult to accommodate the realities of this kind of political change. The reality of having a representative system and at the same time referenda. And they desperately want to think that referenda are an exception, something that is very rare and we will not be doing a lot of it in the future. We will be doing a lot of it in the future. There will be increasing components of popular involvement in political life. And that is partly because strictly representative systems cannot generate legitimacy on their own. At points in time, they have to appeal to a broader level of legitimacy, which comes from direct citizen involvement. And this, of course, is an ideal climate within which populism can flourish. And with populism, you do get increased levels of stridency about political opinions and a little less preoccupation about the niceties of the truth. Does this mean that populism as such is something that we ought to resist? I think that is pointless. I also think that populism itself is not just one thing. It is ideologically shapeless. You can have populisms of the left, you can have populisms of the right. Populism has been a feature of American politics for more than a century, been very important at local state levels. Populism doesn't always look the way that the most offensive right-wing populisms of Europe currently do. How am I doing for time?
I think you're still doing fine.
Shall I speak? Have I lost you, or are you're still with me here? Okay. Let's run 5 more minutes. Does that sound good? And then you can stand up and say, "This is terrible. Everything you have said is wrong. Not just wrong, but super wrong, and double star wrong," something of that sort. So where do I stand in all of this? Where does truth fit into the picture? Well, I don't think it fits in with us saying that we must always tell the truth, either in personal life or in politics. I certainly don't think we should expect higher moral standards of politicians than we expect of ourselves. I think that truthfulness is not a matter of simply pedantically saying the truth all the time, but in a more Aristotelian formulation, truthfulness is about saying the right truths at the right time to the right people. And that is a complex moral accomplishment. So, if my wife says to me, my wife Suzanne, in the morning, "Does my bottom look big in this?" She says that to me. What am I to say? Is the expectation there of complete honesty and candour? If your partner was to say, "Does my bottom look big in this?" to you, what would you say? Would you say, "Yes, do not stand in front of the sun or we will have an eclipse. It is enormous. How big do you want your bottom to look in those?" No, we do not say that. It is not a request for information. Incidentally, my wife has the perfect size bottom, neither too large nor too small. That's a matter of public record now, so if anyone asks. Or, if you are beside a friend who's on their deathbed, and you know something. You know about the infidelity of their partner, and you should have told them long ago, but your friend is on their deathbed. Is that moment the right moment to tell them? Is that the moment when the truth ought to be told? Is there not something about truth-telling which introduces the possibility of a certain kind of tragedy? The possibility that there are some truths which should be told, or should have been told, but the moment has passed. And now one can no longer tell the truth without terrible harms, without lacerating the other. So here, while I want to say that truth is fundamental, we cannot move beyond truth. The business of caring about one another, of living with one another, of being part of a community, involves a recognition that truthfulness is a complex moral accomplishment. There are times for it to be told and times when it ought not to be told. Of course, the problem in political life is that the times when truth ought to be told are often occasions on which the truth is not told. And then we have legitimate grounds for complaint. When a political leader speaks about, say, a hurricane, again, Mr. Trump, and says, there have been about 18 deaths, and we know there have been 3,000 because we have the pictures of the 3,000. We have the pictures of the devastation. We know on that occasion that this is a moral failure and a political failure, that we are owed more than they are given. So this gives you an idea of the kinds of issues and the way of thinking that I use in the book. But I will give you a warning as well. In fairness, because on this occasion the truth ought to be told. There is also a slightly technical section towards the end about the nature of truth and the importance of recognising that there are moral truths. And I have that section at the end for a very simple reason. That historically, the attempt to undermine our commitment to truth as such has tended to take a strategic form, whereby first of all come the attacks upon the idea of moral truth, and then once it seems nice to abandon the idea that there really are moral truths, there is an attempt to generalise out into other areas as well. So I want to block challenges to truth by defending the importance of the idea of moral truths. And that's a slightly less technical section, but you won't hit that until late on in the text. I think I've said enough. Yeah. I think that's. I've been in your seats before at book launches by other people, and I think, when will they stop? Will this desolate desert of words never end? And so I think I will be discreet and draw a line this far and no further.
Thank you. We were thinking that we would open the Q&A section right away, but then during your talk I actually realized that the book has just become available, and nobody, I guess, except me, maybe in this room, and I don't know, a few other people working on it, did not have an opportunity to read it. So let me add a few more things that I remember from the book, because it seems to me that in your talk you concentrated especially on the content of those chapters that are dealing with the current political situation and populism and truth-telling in contemporary politics compared to the past. But there are quite a few you said that at the end, right, of your talk as a warning, right, that there are a few, let's say, semi-technical chapters, or should I say, maybe mid-range kind of technicality, not highest level and not too popular either, but I guess you were shooting for kind of mid-range. So let me mention a few of these issues, the main issues as I remember them, and I'm thinking that this might be also useful for the conference, because as far as I can see, it's mostly consisting of my colleagues who are professional philosophers, and they might be interested in these, let's say, more technical issues about truth and realism and things like that. So I just say that, I guess, the book opens with these kind of observations that already involve a fair bit of theory when you're observing about the suitability of truth-telling, right? And there is already a bit of pressure that you're putting on some particular normative theories like Kantianism that forbids lying under any circumstance. So that's how the book opens. So there is already a bit of normative theorizing in there, but of course later on, and I knew that about based on my knowledge of your previous work, that you are one of those people who are actually against an excessive theorizing in ethics, and there is a chapter where you are explaining your stance towards ethical theory of any sort, in particular those, I guess, major ethical theories that are available today, virtue ethics, Kantianism, and consequentialism. So you're explaining your stance towards those theories and how we should perhaps do ethics that is, let's say, more detail-based and closer to the actual moral phenomenology of our lives. Okay, and then there are these, I don't know, two chapters, one on the nature of truth, and there is Frege, and there is Paul Horridge. So this is the at the kind of like mid-range level, I guess, technicality. Right. So the chapter on the fundamentality of the concept of truth, and lastly a section about truth in moral discourse, and specifically moral realism, and you're providing a useful survey of some major positions, again not overly technical, major position concerning this sort of 20th century debate in meta-ethics concerning truth in ethics, and particular forms of moral realism or anti-realism. And my understanding was that you're eventually reaching a certain kind of, you're coming to agree with a certain kind of moral realism. And this is where I was not like completely following the argument, so maybe we can have a discussion about that. So I felt that this might be a useful supplement to your presentation, and you guys are welcome to, I guess, ask Tony these questions about truth in general, fundamentality of truth, his views about Davidson and Frege and Horridge, as well as his stances on anti-theory in ethics and his views on moral realism. So, without further ado, do you want to do you want to add anything?
There is all of that.
All right.
It's strange because it's a small book, but there's lots of things, including the chapter on definability and the indefinability of truth. Why nothing works as a concept for as a definition.
So it's fundamental but indefinable. Yeah. So without further ado, I guess we can open this to Q&A section, and so you're, I guess, welcome to ask questions about Tony's views about populism, or I mean, there is also a lot of really like commentary, your views on particular political issues, for instance, Palestinian-Israeli conflict,
Yes,
the
yes.
criticism of Israel in the West, whether it's fair or
Yeah,
not,
yeah.
and you're thinking that it's not quite fair.
Yeah.
So you can ask these questions about populism in contemporary politics and Tony's views on populism, and as well as questions about normative ethics, meta-ethics, theory of truth. So I open this to the Q&A part, Q&A section. This is how the book looks like. It's lovely. Thank you, the designer, again. You're right.
So I completely agree with what you said about the moral complexity of truth-telling and issues surrounding the extent to which truthfulness is expected in all situations.
Yeah.
And I also see the point behind sort of concerns that you mentioned in connection with Arendt and Derrida about the complexity of lying.
Yeah.
And that's, so I want to start with there, saying that yes, lying often is a reasonable response in many situations, but it has to be a sophisticated lying.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, if my wife asks me how much is on my account,
Yeah.
I have to really come up with sophisticated answer.
Really?
And she's an economist. She understands economics. So what I feel as a changing situation in a public domain is that demand on sophistication is somehow lacking.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Okay, so these guys, whether it's Trump or others, are just randomly bubbling sentences which don't seem to be, in any sense, even with on the truth side, don't seem to be sophisticated or warranted or justified or so. So I see some major movement in that direction.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that too. That's the blatant and obvious nature of the lies is something we perhaps haven't seen in Europe and in North America since maybe since the 1930s. I mean, we've seen this before, but it's. I think that speaks to a certain attitude about how one understands democracy. See, my understanding of the best kind of democracy that we can have is one that aims towards some kind of consensus. And by that I don't mean agreement. I mean consensus deliberation. So, for example, you get a referendum on a particular issue. One side wins, the other side loses. What happens then? Does the side that wins take this as a license to promote their position in any way they like? Or do they say, look, we're going to try and do this, but we're going to ask the other side what's livable? What can you put up with? And then we will make some kind of accommodation towards that. But instead of that, we have something of a situation whereby parties and political figures will win a referendum or they will win an election and they will be maybe 51% of the population, usually a lot less, 51% of those who vote, and then the attitude is, well, as long as the 51% believe me, I don't care. I don't care what my political opponents think. So Donald Trump, for example, is not particularly worried about what happens in terms of the ideas among Latinos and persons of colour and people who just won't vote for him. He's a little bit more perplexed about the Jewish community and why the Jewish community is the least likely to vote for Donald Trump. And one gets this again in in the UK over the Brexit argument, it is almost certainly, well, I would think it's extremely likely that the Conservative Party is about to win an election in the UK, and they care about having enough support. And whatever anybody else thinks, they're not worried about that. If the rest of the people can recognise obvious lies, then they're not worried about it. So there is something about the lack of commitment to anything like consensus deliberation that promotes an indifference towards the way in which one is perceived by large sections of the population. And this is not, I think, something that's exclusive to the political right. I think that this is true also of the left. I'm someone who would identify myself as being part of the left, but there's some dreadful falsehoods and dreadful, honest, blatant lies that come out of my side, and I'm appalled by this. It's very difficult to say no. We should worry about what our opponents think. We shouldn't simply be trying to consolidate our position. We should be trying to speak across those divides. And the absence of that seems to be something not so much new, but a recurrence of the worst indifference to political opponents from the past. People not caring about whether they are seen as liars or by the other side, and that's worrying. So, yeah.
Yeah, something came to my mind, but it's still under construction, so maybe it's going to be a little bit blurry. I was thinking about, I just recently read a book and I saw that series about John Adams, the second president of the United States. And what I miss on current political discussions is that the people who are, say, elected, they don't even have discussions which are like, theoretically solid. If I remember, let's say at the beginning of the 90s, there were really solid discussions here in Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, what we're supposed to do in the coming years, what are, say, the objectives, what makes sense for the development of the country. And I'm just trying to link it a little bit to that constant online broadcasting of everything what has been told, or what we are saying. There are simply no situation in our lives that we can have a discussion. I mean, the politicians, they cannot have a discussion, like open discussion in the parliament without being recorded and broadcasted. So my question is, where is such a technological pressure in itself, or what do you think about it, that this technological pressure itself is putting those people in the position to be populist because they want to be elected, so they constantly say something what is not necessarily truth, even, let's say, to their beliefs. It doesn't reflect their beliefs, because they know that they have to say something to be, say, visible, to provoke, to rebel, to be significantly radical than the others, just to simply step out from their own. So what do you think that about, say, this technological pressure to the politicians and, let's say, the dynamics with truth-telling and even the truth-telling between, let's say, themselves?
I suppose the issue always comes up, how much of their current predicament is generated by social media and the internet and the continuous availability of what politicians are saying. Some of it does come from that. It's difficult to compare any politician, though, with the founding fathers, with John Adams and people of that sort. When one looks through the Federalist Papers and some of the literature of the time, nothing better has ever been written about how you build a democracy. So it might be a slightly unfair comparison to expect to expect the leader of the Labour Party in England or the leader of the Conservative Party to have that kind of grasp of human realities that comes out of the adversity that the Founding Fathers went through. I'm not sure about just how much pressure is something that comes from social media. There is pressure there. Social media has shown us that many of our political figures are not deep thinkers. They are, in fact, quite the opposite of deep thinkers on a wide range of subjects, and that has been a shock to many people. On the one hand, we don't like what we see when we see them speak about stuff that they just don't know about. Things that President Trump says about the climate are crazy. Things that have come out of the Labour Party in the UK about Jews are blatantly anti-Semitic and offensive. Things that Boris Johnson of the Conservative Party says bears no relation to economic realities. Things of that sort. But we also don't like them to be too stage managed and too Tony Blair and too smooth, and we don't like it to appear obvious that it's a constructed image. But I think that some of the criticism that politicians get is deserved, and it's not an unfairness generated by the internet. Of course, if we expect them to be Kantians or something of that sort, and to stand up and never lie, well, we don't do that. That's not a way in which human beings work. We don't have that expectation. But there's also certain kinds of manipulation, certain kinds of drawing of politicians from the same social background all the time, that means that they have a fairly narrow outlook on things. The UK is a very good example of this. On one side of Parliament stands someone who has a private, expensive education and who was inducted into a system of political patronage at the end of his teens. On the other side of the chamber is a politician who has had a very expensive education, not quite so expensive, who was inducted into a system of political patronage at the end of his teens. And it introduces a kind of narrowness, a lack of political flair. And I think that when we have that expectation of personally having a voice and having something that goes beyond those traditional forms of representative democracy, I think that's the primary driver. And there is the complication and there are the unfairnesses that are introduced by social media. But I think that social media has done as much to expose a problem that was already there as it has to, as it were, generate a new kind of problem in truth-telling. Richard Nixon didn't need the internet in order to lie to the American people. He was perfectly able to do that prior to them, and we were able to spot the lie without the internet being there.
I might have a question that hopefully would interest other people in the audience as well. That one of those themes that I mentioned earlier, that in that, let's say, more in those chapters that are concerned with contemporary politics, one of the things that you're mentioning as someone who identifies as a person of the left, and at the same time is dissatisfied with on the left in contemporary on contemporary British political scene is the anti-Israeli stance of contemporary Labour under Corbyn, and and I was surprised that you're not shying away from the conclusion that their stance is basically anti-Semitic, and just occurred to me that I've in the past few days I had this discussion on Facebook with one local friend who's himself an intellectual and identifies as a man of the left as well, and he thinks that these accusations are unfair. He's open to suggestion that, or he's certainly accepting that these comments that are coming from the contemporary Labour against Israel, that they are unfair, that they are unjustified, but he thinks that unfairness does not necessarily boil down to anti-Semitism. So how would you, and I'm kind of open to that too, that, I mean, there is no necessarily any of those available comments, any suggestion of like any references like to some kind of pseudoscience, pseudobiology of race or anything like that. So how would you respond to that I guess, comment that even from someone who's open to accept that criticism, that Labour, contemporary Labour, is one-sided when it comes to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but you would go further. You would say that it's anti-Semitism.
Yes, and here as a point of clarification, I think there should be a Palestinian state. I think it's becoming very difficult to make steps towards that because of the fragmentation of the political forces on the Palestinian the Palestinian side. I differ significantly from those who want to rush to Mr. Corbyn's defence in a number of respects. One of which is that I think their narrative about the history of the Labour Party is wrong. I think the Labour Party has always had a combination of left themes and fairly right-wing political themes, particularly on issues such as immigration and attitudes towards foreigners and attitudes towards Jewish people.
And LGBT.
Yes, it is. It is interesting that you can have on the one hand, Labour events are always very pro-LGBT, but then you ask, where have they introduced the legislation on sexual equality? Nowhere. It is most of the prime ministers and first ministers in Westminster and in Northern Ireland and in Scotland and in the Welsh Assembly, most of them have been from the Labour Party since those assemblies were formed. But in Scotland, it was the Scottish National Party that introduced those measures. In Ireland, it's been championed among the people such as the SDLP, Sinn Féin, and with a sort of nod and a wink from the Ulster Unionists. And in England, it was introduced by the Conservative Party. Labour have always avoided moving to actual legislative steps to bring about any situation of equality because they have a backbone of blue-collar working-class support, among whom that prejudice is still very much alive, and they do not want to alienate any of their
Sorry, I interrupted you with this, so...
Yeah, and that's always been an issue. So the Labour was formed in the early 1900s, and then you have the post-First World War period. But from the very beginning, there is an anti-Semitic strand within the Labour Party. In areas of London, they were the ones who campaigned against Jewish migrants. in order to bring about what's known as the Aliens Act, which was the first piece of anti-immigrant legislation in modern UK history. There is a long track record, well before Mr Corbyn, of sections of the left criticising the Labour Party for its attitude towards Jews, and particularly a discourse about Jewish bankers, Zionism, and the disproportionate influence of Jews within the financial system. That is an anti-Semitic discourse. It is not a new charge. It has been there for more than 100 years. It has been there since the very beginning of the Labour Party. There have been individuals removed from positions in the Labour Party well before Mr Corbyn arrived. The idea that this is a new charge introduced by the right to discredit Mr Corbyn does not match up to anything that one would recognise as the truth. It is an example of a kind of convenient dishonesty by the political side that I am on. So it is. We demand more honesty from Trump, but it then behooves us, when we say to people on the right, you have to stand up and be counted for liberal democracy in the face of this dreadful political figure. It then behooves people on the left to do the same thing when we have people running Trump-type positions, even if it hurts us, even if it's politically inconvenient. So we've gone more to the politics than to indefinability and deflationism and theories of truth. But yes, the politics is always interesting. It is always interesting.
So I'm going to try to link the two, the theory and the politics. So is there sort of from a outside of the theories of truth, is there a particular theory of truth that is particularly well suited for analyzing the, say, political discourse or sort of everyday utterances?
Yeah, I think that there are large areas of judgment that humans engage in, which are very unlike mathematics and physics. And in mathematics and especially in physics, we think that in some sense the truth is comprehensively independent of human beings and independent of our responses. But in the case of a large range of judgments that we engage in on an everyday basis, about comedy, about moral matters, about the ethical suitability of what a political figure is doing, I think that we have to have a more response-dependent approach towards truth. Now, what I mean by that, you will know some of this stuff, or all of this stuff. I will give a simple example. Now, my father, bless him, lovely man, he doesn't think that the Beatles are good musicians. He has never thought the Beatles were good musicians. No, he is wrong about that. Yeah? Now, I say that not because I have a particular appreciation of the music of the Beatles. I like some of it, other parts I don't. But what is there to being a good musician? Well, simply the fact that what one does is able to promote a certain kind of response predictably among listeners who are able to appreciate a certain kind of background, and this happens time and time again. So if it works, if it pleases audiences, if it does so over multiple generations, the argument is over. You don't have to like the Beatles in order to recognise they are good musicians. So then the judgment about the Beatles are good musicians, the Beatles' music is good music, that judgment depends upon how human beings respond to the music. It's an example of a truth which is, in a certain sense, response dependent. And we can see this again in comedy. Now, I am terrible when it comes to comedy, which you may have gathered from my awful, awful sense of humour, which is evident at several points. My wife, Suzanne, is very good at recognising good comedy, and I'm dreadful. I can't. But I don't therefore say it's all subjective, there are no truths about this matter. I say rather, look, you like this person, and it seems that audiences do as well. And they liked them 10 years ago, and when they're introduced in a new country, and people have enough of the background, then they seem to like that comedian too. And so I'm prepared to accept that it's true that they are a good comedian, even though I will never be able to appreciate it. But the right kind of audience, the right kind of responder is able to grasp the meanings, and that's what makes it, the claim about the comedy being good comedy, that's what makes it true. So in those contexts, a more response-dependent approach towards the nature of truth works, whereas in the case of physics and mathematics, we think of truth as something that's independent of response. But in both cases, there is something similar, and that is that truth is always about normativity. It always says something about what is the right kind of response, what is the right way to proceed. So I'm kind of tempted to say, does anybody know Led Zeppelin? One or two people have, Led Zeppelin. They have a song, which is "The song remains the same." So I'm kind of tempted to say that in different contexts, the normativity remains the same. Normativity is always bound up with truth. Truth tracks norms. And that, whether it's in comedy, whether it's in judgments of politics, whether it's in mathematics, physics, or in a concept of truth in, say, some artificial language or something of that kind. I mean, that gets us into a little bit more technical territory. Generally speaking, I don't think we can define truth in the way that we once hoped to. I don't think we can say that truth is correspondence, truth is coherence, truth is whatever works, pragmatic definition. Nothing like that will work because the concept of truth is so deep. So many of our other concepts are entangled with it that you would have to provide a complete description of everything that we are likely to believe and understand how we might respond in order to provide a comprehensive account of truth. It is a deep thing connected up to many other things, so no simple account of truth will capture it. But there are many platitudes about truth, such as truth is a guide to action, truth depends upon the way the world is, things of that sort. And you can say many of these platitudes, and for any domain, whether it's economics, whether it's comedy, whether it's morality, whether it's physics, you can look at that list of platitudes, and some of them will apply, and others won't. And that will help you to understand whether the domain of discourse is one which is realist, or whether it's one that's quasi-realist or anti-realist, and so on. So we're always, in a certain sense, playing the same kind of games when we talk about truth. But we're not necessarily playing those same games with the same, in an identical way.
What do you think? Right.
I like the response. It's just that it's difficult for me to see the staying the same of normativity, playing out. I mean, I would need to know more about how does this play out in mathematics and physics as opposed to political discourses.
Yeah. But that's not going to be.
I don't expect
that. Yeah. No. You do, yeah.
Yes.
I would like to ask, what's your view of truth value. You know, if you go more with this sort of false truth is an opposition, which we can assign to particular judgments or assertions, or whether you would allow for certain continuum that something can be more or less true or false, and how would it, and if yes, if you would allow for such a continuum, how would you describe it?
I think I'm tempted to say something like this, that there's talk about everyday objects, about this and the microphone. Never touch microphones, they always make a big noise. And there is, you know, it's either true or not that there's a glass here, and that's very straightforward. So in the domain of discourse where we're talking about ordinary, regular-sized objects, it's with possible weird, strange exceptions, it's really bivalent. It's either true, the claim is either true or false. But in certain kinds of domains of discourse where value judgments become more complex, then there may be areas where there are simply truth-value gaps. It's that certain claims are neither true nor false. So I'm going to say something about the claim that murder is wrong. Yeah, that's straightforward. That's true. Somebody thinks that, well, murder is maybe not so wrong. Then I'm going to make sure that there are other people around in the room. And if I think they really believe that, and it's not just something that someone says in an undergraduate seminar or something of that sort, then I'm going to contact the people who deal with Hannibal Lecter and see if this person perhaps also needs to have that same kind of treatment. So there are certain straightforward judgments, but then when you get into more complex moral judgments, for example, is it the right thing to someone says, if you're in a particular constituency in London where the Labour Party have the best chance of beating the Conservative Party, and they say the right thing to do is to vote Labour. No. That's going to be a problem for me. If I want a straightforward idea that their claim is either true or false. There could be a decent case made for it being true. There could be a decent case made for it being false. And it's a claim that reasonable agents who have all the relevant information at any point in time in history might still dispute. It looks like you're edging there with that kind of judgment towards an area where there is in fact something like a truth-value gap. Something like, is Jeremy Corbyn an anti-Semite, or is the Labour Party got a serious problem with anti-Semitism? I don't know. That's straightforward. But then the pragmatics of politics introduce you into areas where sometimes there isn't a right and wrong within a range of options. There are some things that are clearly right, clearly true. There are some things that are clearly false. And then you get into this grey area where a large number of propositions may in fact not fit neatly into that bivalent schema that we apply to judgments about glasses on table, cats on mats, and so on. And that's not something I develop in detail in the book. I think it's probably an implication of my position. It wouldn't worry me if I turned out to be wrong about that. I assume that I am wrong about many things. I could be wrong about that too. But I don't see the reason why judgments about morality, comedy, and some of the areas where the pragmatics of politics enter into question. I don't see the need to have some kind of strict bivalence, some strict truth or falsity about every single intelligible claim in these domains. I think some of them can just be very hazy.
Just as a clarification, so that example that you gave earlier about murder, so that it was supposed to be that the claim that murder is wrong is true.
It's true, yeah.
Right? And but you're still committed to, I guess, specifying that as, you know, even this this claim, I mean, and saying that it's true, I guess nobody would disagree. Even that claim is still response dependent.
Yeah, I think that's. I think it's response dependent. I think that the truth and falsity of moral judgment is about humans.
Mm-hmm.
It's there's nothing, as it were, structured into the nature of the universe, thought of independently of humans, that makes that true. It is specifically about us.
Because that's the kind of typical example about murder being wrong, slavery being wrong. These are the examples usually, I guess, used by industrial strength moral realists. They say that this is true, meaning, you know, no matter what things, and even if we eliminated humankind maybe from the earth, from the face of this planet, these claims would still be true. They are eternally true. There are moral facts that make these claims true independently of their being agents with their responses. Right?
Yeah,
and so your position is kind of really, I mean, it's difficult, and I did not expect like a full-blown justification of that sort of middle ground position, right, that you have with respect to the question of moral realism, but I mean, it's a difficult one, right? I mean, on the one hand, these, let's say, industrial strength realisms, right, with moral facts as being part of the fabric of the universe and all that, and you don't accept that. And on the other hand, you survey several versions of non-cognitivism, starting with emotivism and all that, and you reject those two. So you have to maintain this difficult position in somewhere in the middle, or not exactly in the middle, somewhere in between.
The difficult positions are always the more interesting. The more interesting ones. You could go counterfactual and say, if there are no humans, but we still make sense of the fact that murder is wrong through some sort of counterfactual claim about if there were humans, then typically a sane human who was not psychologically disturbed would respond to, and you can run that kind of thing. But people who think that you can make sense of murder, the truth, murder is wrong, without any reference to human attitudes and patterns of response, I think that is just people who want the universe to have a certain quality that it does not have. Now, you can still cash out the position that I'm saying in terms of moral properties, if you like. You can say that certain events have dispositional properties, so they're disposed to give rise to certain kinds of responses, but the dispositional quality talk always requires talk about responders and agents. And I'm kind of agnostic about whether talking about the moral properties of particular actions is helpful. It might be in some contexts. I think there are equivalent vocabularies that don't make it sound as if morality and physics are the same kinds of things. But yes, morality only makes sense in relation to agents and responders. There's nothing. The Big Bang did not create morality. that morality is something that's a human institution, best understood in terms of our responses, or in response to if there were other intelligent creatures who are not humans, then it would be you reframe the point.
So you would be really like if you had more space, or if you were to write an entire and maybe more technical book on these issues in metaethics, I'm sensing that you're kind of siding with those people who, some of them at least, did not hesitate to call them all realists, who are like those philosophers in Britain in, let's say, 80s and 90s, like McDowell and so, but not the realists of the American sort, like
Cornell realists.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Right.
So yeah, okay. So you have it precisely. But I don't like the way that John McDowell writes. I think it's really, really unnecessarily complicated and geared towards the 6 people in the world who can understand the text. But I think that he's kind of right, and that if we must use the language of moral properties that actions and events have, then we should make sure that we are not, as it were, borrowing too much from the language of the physical properties of things within physics and chemistry and so on. Properties, the concept of a property is not being used in quite the same way in those two contexts. So we shouldn't be cheating by sort of smuggling in a kind of physical robustness that is not there. But what worries people about this, it worried me, is that we're asking some of the wrong questions. That we desperately want to say that rape is wrong, and it's true that rape is wrong. Of course it has to be wrong. Someone who genuinely believed that there was no truth about whether or not rape is wrong, I mean genuinely, not philosophy seminar talk, but genuinely believed that, would not be someone with a different position. They would be someone with a psychological disorder and a terrible attitude towards other human beings. So we desperately want to be able to say that the judgment rape is wrong is true, is right. But what we need there is not something about the structure of atoms and how they combine, or something that happened at the Big Bang that magically sprang morality into existence. We don't need that. What we need is the supplying of reasons, the process of justification. And justifications have to end somewhere, not necessarily in the same place. But all we need is a point where we can say, who could ask for anything more? If I say to you that today, yesterday, tomorrow, and through all time, any normal, rational agent who is not burdened with some extremely psychological problems and who is able to get on with other human beings and act in a fairly decent way and so on, and yes, I know that there are normative components in that, any such agent is going to affirm, if they're being honest, that rape is wrong. They're going to affirm that truth. And then I say, who could ask for anything more? That's all you need. Our problem is that we want to, as it were, have one thought too many, or several thoughts too many, and want a kind of physicality about the universe that is the truth maker for that. We're looking at the wrong thing.
I'm thinking this is still difficult to maintain because you're always saying these things with an implied added explanation or rejoinder that these things are true within the human world, right? Or for creatures who have human attitudes and are not disturbed or psychotic, but then again, you end up agreeing with the psychotic or sociopath when, without that rejoinder, you're bound to agree with them. After all, if they're saying that these things are not true, because if you're speaking about the universe at large, I agree with the sociopath. I mean, I think you're committed to.
I'm saying that it's a truth of, that 2 + 2 = 4 is a truth of mathematics. It is not a truth of morality. Murder is wrong and rape is wrong is a truth of morality. It is not a truth of mathematics or a truth of physics. Now, from the fact that something is not, that a truth is not, as it were, embedded within physics, or something of that sort, the sociopath is someone who thinks that the truth can't be robust enough. So I have a very different view about the robustness of truth within morality, which Hannibal Lecter does not share. He thinks that because truth in morality is not like truth in physics, then truth in morality is not really real. But I think that the standards of realism are robust. And so we really are going to have a disagreement about that. Just as, so I think it's the recognition that there are different domains, and that the concept of truth operates in ways which differ across the domain, and then recognizing what domain you're operating in, and how truth functions, and whether truth is going to be, as it were, a verification transcendent, or whether truth is going to be a response dependent, or any of these things. They only make sense once you're dealing with a specific domain of discourse. The mistake of the sociopath, the psychopath, and so on, is that they take 1 or 2 domains as special and privileged. They think that the concept of truth is really just truth as we understand it within physics, truth as we understand it within the natural sciences. And I think that that's not, historically, that's not how the concept of truth has evolved. It's not the concept of truth that we use most of the time. Most of our lives, we're ordinary humans. We are not physicists. We are not mathematicians. So our grasp of truth has to relate to. If anything has got a claim to being the core of our understanding of truth, it is how truth works in those familiar, everyday human contexts.
I wonder if you get really this everyday aspect of truth, if it applies to the sentence murder is wrong, because I find it such a baffling concept or statement. I don't think you find other people apart from philosophers making such statements. What does it really mean? Who are we telling? Why are we telling someone that murder is wrong?
Yeah.
Is there a possibility of disagreeing with that?
Yeah.
Of convincing the other person that murder is wrong? I don't think so. So, is that a statement, really? Because obviously murder is a negative word, I agree with that, but why do we need to spell out that it is wrong?
Yeah.
I went looking through the civil code of the Czech Republic, and nowhere does it say that murder is wrong. Right? Why should it? So, are we not putting too much stress on this being wrong?
Yeah.
This is kind of a Wittgensteinian point,
Yeah,
isn't it? Right? That only philosophers use certain examples. And
But it's not. I don't think it's entirely true, because we do tell children that a variety of things that they know.
Yeah, but not about murder. I don't think we explain the concept of murder by saying it is wrong.
I think that's probably right. So I don't know how much. If we are in a kind of philosophical discussion about how truth functions, then that's that's a language game, if you want to use a Wittgensteinian terminology, and within that language game, talk about murder being wrong as a particular kind of role. So it's not as if all the language games are the stuff that exists outside of philosophy or academic philosophy. There's also academic philosophy itself, and it has a role within that. But I'm very much with you on the idea of that we sometimes try to justify things that, or argue for things that don't really need. So the book, which I'm promoting shamelessly at this point, starts off not by claiming that I provided, as it were, an argument for the importance of truth, but rather an affirmation. So the book, in a sense, is just affirming the importance of truth, and I have no pretense of providing a systematic, sound argument for the importance of truth. Indeed, that would be circular, because the soundness would presuppose the importance of truth and so on. So it's much more a sense of, in a time when people are floating around these ideas of post-truth and questioning the value of truth, what I'm doing is affirming the importance of truth, and I'm doing several other things as well. But I think it's a good question to ask about what are we doing when we do philosophy, and whether we need to be doing some of the things that we do. So I'm sure that I do things that in the book that don't need to be done, just because I succumb to temptations that we share because of the common dreadful background that we have to being properly trained. But sometimes I try to resist those temptations. For example, I don't build a theory or a comprehensive theory of truth. Not so much because I'm anti-theory. I don't like the anti-theory label. I think theories have a role to play. And we have to mark essays about something, and a theory is sometimes as good a thing to mark an essay about as anything else. But I think that theories only do a certain number of limited tasks, and there are many other tasks that then need to be performed in ethics and in understanding in understanding ethics. But maybe you're right. Maybe it's a bad example. Murder is wrong. It could be. I'm a philosopher. We use bad examples all the time. It is a professional hazard, I think. Yeah.
Would that last comment about anti-theory, would that extend also to your stance with respect to standard normative theories? That, I mean, I said earlier that the way I read that chapter was that you are sympathetic to those ethicists nowadays who argue explicitly against any theory, right? They say they are anti-theory people. And so would that, so maybe I identified you with them too closely, maybe you like sympathetic to the cause, but you think that there is a place for theory at some level to some extent, even in normative ethics?
I think you located my position broadly in the right way, and then there's the refinement process. So I use the phrase modest particularism. So particularists some particularists say theory is fine, but we shouldn't rely too much on it. Some particularists say there are no moral principles, we shouldn't claim that there are, and others say, yay, principles have an important role to play, not as the core of moral theory, but as hints, clues, and reminders. And I quite like that. When we're teaching children, we want to, we do use moral principles. It's an important thing to do when we are trying to make sense of what it would be like to really be a good person. And newsflash, I am not. I'm not a really good person. I think I'm morally average. There may be some saints among you, possibly. I expect multiple narratives on the question of your personal sainthood. But if we try to make sense of what it would be like to try and become an agent of that sort, then we might talk about principles and those kinds of things. So I have an idea that Kant's moral theory is a great historic accomplishment, as is John Stuart Mill's work on liberty and all of these things, and that they matter. They're great accomplishments, and were they engaging in moral theory? Yes, they were. Were they trying to build the correct moral theory? Yes, they were. Do I think it's better that the world has these texts than not have them? Yes, I do. So I'm happy. But if once the theory people, the correct moral theory people, start to get territorially ambitious and think that everything falls within a particular kind of moral theory, then I get more worried about that. So I use these shifting descriptions for myself. I think at the moment I would describe myself as a moral, a modest particularist, and as a normative pluralist. I think that human beings in our best available configuration are responsive to multiple sources of normativity, multiple values, and that theories go particularly wrong when they try to identify one thing or one overriding principle that is at the core of everything else. I do not believe that such a principle it exists. I think that our base configuration is one in which we are capable of recognising multiple sources of normativity, which may often conflict with each other, generating tragic dilemmas and difficult decisions.
My question goes back to the status of the truth. I like you differentiate, separate fields of asking this question. For example, the example with the glass, and then the field of morality and common life and so on. So you refuse the ontological status of truth. I would agree definitely. And go to the social status of truth, which is different in different fields, obviously. But I would go even further and claim that you said it already, but you said that there are sentences, claims, which are kind of hard, which are not true or false, or they are in strange status. I would claim that most of our claims are such way. I mean, we cannot apply this truth-false status to most of our claims, I would say. As I understand you, you claim that truth is kind of basis which is applicable in different fields, but differently.
Yeah.
And I would go further and say that that you are maybe still too attached to the previous example with the glass. Mm-hmm. You see it kind of as a prototype of the truth situation, and then you try to apply it also to the fields where it's maybe strange or hard to applicate it. And now I would like to move my question to the field of politics, which is kind of topic of our session today. The book is called Truth, the Age of Populism. And I would like to ask you, if we should think about populism in the terms of truth. That would be my question, and I will explain more. Because I would say that populism is not all the time about truth and falsity, because I mean there can be also populism which is based on truth.
Yeah.
It's not, and we usually, as the discourse is settled, we usually say we are the right people and they are the populists which lie.
Yeah.
It's obviously not true. And I would like to ask you if we should even think about politics in the terms of truth. If we can kind of dig out the truth of a political statement per se, because I'm not sure about it. I would say that it's more about some let's say morality of different people, and as you have already said, we can have different opinions on particular fields of how our political system should work and so on, and it's definitely not obvious. We cannot say that it's true that it should be settled like this. It's about some discussion, some trying, and then applying this. Okay, so I will finish it. Maybe I'm right now talking too long. So
okay, yes, I think you're correct about our differences and some of the areas of agreement. I think you're more worried about the binary opposition of truth and falsity than I am. I have an idea that when it comes to morality, we need a concept of truth that is workable and livable for humans, and that a concept of truth in relation to morality which scarcely allows there to be any moral truth would not be a livable morality. I think that morality is constrained. When it comes to individual ethics, then there are a wide range of things that we can believe as long as they're psychologically available. I think that a morality in which there is no moral truth is not psychologically available for ordinary rational agents. When it comes to social, when it comes to applying that kind of talk to politics, we're much more in the domain of social ethics. And social ethics, I think, needs constraints as well, but the constraints are in some respects more rigid. So, for example, what are the good-making features of an ethic about the climate, or an ethic about our relationship to animals, or an ethic about how we move out into space, things of that sort? Well, overall, such an ethic needs to be psychologically available. It has to be something that humans can actually commit to and follow in the moments where they have to make the decisions. It has to be politically viable in the sense that it has to be the kind of ethic that could actually shape and inform political institutions. And I think that it has to be stable as well, and not simply a matter of local historical fashion, especially when we're tackling some of the big ethical problems which span multiple generations. So one thinks about the relationship of humans to the environment. That's a multi-generational question. So if we have to have an ethical response to that and an understanding of truth within ethics that fits in with a multi-generational attitude towards things, then we need a certain kind of stability that is not afforded by the ups and downs of different governments changing every 5 years. So I think of ethics as something that is, in a sense, much more constrained, I think, than you do. But I get the sense of there being a problem about how we accommodate a multiplicity of different value standpoints and how that works into political policy. And not so much in the book here, but generally I've argued for a position on this that the book fits into. And that is that within liberal democracies, we don't or shouldn't have one section of the population imposing their norms and values upon other sections of the population who have reasonable, plausible ways in which people can live. So, do we then say that anything goes? Say, no, we don't. What we do is we differentiate between different kinds of discussion. There are what we might call, and here I'm borrowing from Crispin Wright a little bit in his terminology, not in his theories, but in the terminology. We have discussions that are policy apt and appropriate to shape legislation and the direction of governments and so on. And that's what we do when we're writing white papers on things. And I don't know, there will be philosophers, some of us will be philosophers, and yes, we do occasionally get invited to be part of that process. And then there are those precursor discussions, which are not directly aiming to be policy discussions. And within those, you want to have a multiplicity of different value standpoints, you want lots of different voices, and each of and those who present their different voices will be committed to ideas about their claims being the truth. That's part of being committed to a set of values. And out of that multiplicity of different value standpoints, we try to find enough commonalities that we can then translate that into proposals within policy-apt discussions about how we move forward. And that is how liberal democracy functions. And I know there are limitations to liberal democracy, but until we find a better way of doing things, we're kind of stuck with this as the best option. But those who have those varying value commitments, they will believe fairly robustly in a notion of truth.
The evening is drawing to its close. May I voice one regret about the book that I feel? And then maybe others can respond to that too, because, I mean, I have the privilege that I was able to read the book already and others didn't, but they may respond to this regret. Well, let me start on the positive note, with the praise. I think that those, the analysis, if we might call it that, analysis of populism as a kind of contemporary politics that you provide, it's exactly right. I mean, those two essential points. One, that populist politics presents itself as even more of a democracy than the standard, let's say, liberal democracy. It's more directly the voice of the people than the representative democracy. And the other aspect, or the other essential point that you distinguished, was that populist politics is very oppositional, so it tries to differentiate itself from the swamp, right, from the elites, and all kinds of enemies, both interior and exterior, right? So
real and imaginary.
Yeah. So I mean, these 2 points, and I mean, those that I remember, and there are many other useful observations or points of analysis in those chapters on populist politics that you make, I think are very useful and easily applicable to our current populist politics in this country and maybe other countries in East Central Europe. So the regret is that I thought that your examples all come from Britain and the US, and so it's very Anglo-centric, and there is nothing about continental politics, let alone East European politics. So the book would be even more useful for our current situation in this country if there were some, and we used to have politicians in the past like Václav Havel who were very much concerned with truth in politics, and he had some important publications on the topic of truth, specifically in politics, and even in earlier history, the founder, right, of the modern state, Czechoslovakia, was a philosopher who was, again, like very much concerned with truth in politics and published philosophically on this topic. So it would be even greater if you and I don't know, like, did you? So it seems to me that you wanted to primarily to write a book for the British audience. Right. Or are you familiar with some of these writings?
Yes,
and
yes.
Let us know what you think.
I always tend to write for a US audience because that's what all the data says. My readership about my readership. It is strange. People in the UK have to be told that I'm good, so I have to write stuff that gets read over in the US, and then the US people tell people in the UK, this is good stuff, and then they will read it, but they won't read it until 3 or 4 years after the other thing. That's a deliberate decision. There is a rich tradition of literature, and do I introduce Havel? Do I try and engage with some of the Czech literature? And
not in this book.
No, I don't. Yeah. I don't. Yeah. So that was a deliberate, a deliberate decision, because it would take a different. That would be a task beyond this. Beyond this particular text, and sometimes it's better that the shortcomings are out in the open. And yes, it is written primarily for an English language, for an English language audience, rather than sort of concealing the limitations of its applicability. But I think that part of that comes out of a sense of the model for tensions within liberal democracy. And there's a historic trend to take the UK as a good model. I think the UK is a very bad model.
It turns out it is, yeah. I'm so surprised. I'm constantly being surprised by British politics.
But that's the US is much more of a standard kind of model. You can see much more the hybridity of democracy is much clearer. You have a longer tradition of popular inclusions, of direct democratic institutions, whether it's the town hall meeting that we know from the Simpsons cartoon, it's always going on, and those happen in Vermont and so on. And the town hall meeting is a very white institution. It's a very old in certain areas of states. But you have waves of a shift towards direct inclusions of direct democracy that have happened in the US, and our best understanding of direct democracy comes out of those studies. So maybe a really interesting book would be one that or a different kind of interesting book would be one that made the Czech and the US comparison rather than the UK and the US. But I think the US should be in there because we can see things about democracy and an appreciation of the problems of democracy, which has been there since John Adams and the Founding Fathers and Tocqueville and so on. That's just so much better than the combination of insights and not such good writing that has come out of UK politics. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It draws from what I know most, rather than from anything else. But also, I think there's an appreciation there of a number of things, about problems that are on the horizon, things that are happening. You're a very good publishing house, and you're very open to. But when I said spoke to another publishing house about a book that I'm currently working on, and I said, look, this is going to be about the ethics of political dissent, and I'm going to address the Israel question and why the left, people such as myself, are so dreadful on the issue of Israel, sometimes dreadful, sometimes straightforwardly anti-Semitic. And my editor said, oh, you are so right there. Please don't do that. They will kill you. This will be absolutely destroyed. So I try to write with a view towards problems that are emerging. So when I started the book, my assumption was that Brexit was going to be a complete mess. And but that was before the scale of the mess. It became kind of apparent. And I write with a view that some of the political problems that are emerging about that difficult negotiation between representative democracy and increasing regular inclusions of referenda in direct democracy, that is not just about Brexit. It's not about Donald Trump. That's an ongoing, decades-long feature of the changing nature of our democracy. We can't have a 19th century liberal democracy. That's just would be the attempt to preserve that makes democracy malfunction.
But surely there are some good referenda, like the gay marriage referendum in Australia.
Absolutely, yeah.
They're not all bad.
No. Referenda are often good. If you understand the process of referenda, it's even better. Ireland is a very good case.
Yeah.
They had a referendum on the euro, going into accepting the euro. They rejected doing so. They had a public discussion about what it would take, the changes in order to get agreement. And once that discussion was over, certain measures were taken. They held another referendum to see if public opinion was still the same. And it changed.
I think that's an abuse of the position of the government, really. Asking the same question twice in such a short time.
Well, don't we do that in everyday life?
Well, no. It shows lack of respect.
I think that the issue there is that you expect referenda to function in the same way that representative government functions. So, for example, there is some set kind of period. So a government gets elected and you lose your election, you have to accept that they are the government and they govern. So that's it. But in the case of in the case of referenda, if there is widespread and demonstrated movement of opinions, or if there is a feeling that what was promised in the referendum is radically different from the measures actually taken, then you get a problem. But here, I think, is where political parties come in. And referenda and direct democracy inclusions within a modern system of democracy work best when the political parties do their job. And that's a difficult thing to do, because political parties are almost all of the bad things that people have said about political parties. They do all of that stuff. But when you have a more hybrid system of democracy, when you have increasing components of referenda, voter initiative, recall, and so on, and other systems that we haven't even thought of yet, which are going to be part of democracy in the next 50 years, when you have that, what you end up with on many occasions is conflicting mandates. So you will often find that people vote one way in a referendum, and then at the next, say, representative election, they'll vote for a party that says the precise opposite. And then you have the problem of how you manage conflicting mandates. And that's what political parties should largely be there for, to manage situations of that sort and to try and find a consensus and to make sure that enough is preserved of the conflicting mandates that everyone can live with. And that's what they are not doing. That's in the case of the of the UK. It's gone crazy, and none of the parties is promoting anything that was remotely resembles the referendum on Europe, or in the case of Scotland, for example. The position was stay in the UK because it's the only way to stay in the European Union. We cannot say that referendum now, that the mandate generated by that referendum now works, given that the UK is leaving the European Union. So then the difficult business of negotiation and making sure that the conflicting mandates generated by the different parts of your political system don't comprehensively sap a sense of the legitimacy of liberal democracy.
Right, I think that we should thank Tony for making his book available to us in the translation even earlier than the original language version is going to come out, so we will have this advantage even over the US readership, right, of the book. That's great. So, and thank you for coming today and spending 2 hours with us, and thank you all for coming and for contributing with your questions. Thank you.